The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Dutch writer Abel Hertzberg once said that 6 million Jews were not killed in the Holocaust, but rather one Jew was killed, then another, and another, repeated 6 million times. In a new book called A Hole in the Heart of the World, Jonathan Kaufman traces the history of 5 Eastern European families to capture both the vast scope of the Holocaust and the texture of individual life before, during, and after when anti-Semitism continued to flourish under communist rule. Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who served as Berlin bureau chief for the Boston Globe and currently writes for the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
Tell me about the things you learned when you went to Berlin that led to this book.
I think like a lot of Americans, when we travel, or journalists, when we report stories, we tend to have movies or stereotypes that play in our minds. And I think for me, the movie in my mind, or the musical in my mind, was Fiddler on the Roof. I really believe that the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe were these small, isolated shtetls or communities of Jews really on the fringes of society. When I began to travel around in Budapest and Berlin and all these cities, people would say, well, you should see the synagogue in town. And the synagogue in town, which I expected to be kind of a small synagogue in some out-of-the-way place, in Budapest is as big as St. Patrick's Cathedral, overlooking the main square of Budapest. In Berlin, there were actually 100 synagogues before World War II. And what became clear, and as I learned more and more, Jews were very much integrated into these societies. In Berlin, for example, before World War II, 75% of the plays were written or directed by Jews. In Hungary, Jews were like the Rockefellers. They built the railroads and the factories. Many of them became members of the nobility. In Warsaw, 40% of the lawyers were Jewish. And I think to understand what Jewish life was like in these countries and what they're like today would be to imagine what it would be like if in the United States or in New York or in Chicago there suddenly were no Jews. It wouldn't just be empty synagogues, but almost as if the heart of culture and business and academics was ripped out.
A central piece of the fabric of the life of the country as a whole.
Exactly. And I think the other thing I believed was that Eastern Europe was now a cemetery for Jews, that there was no Jewish life. And that's why it was so surprising as I began to travel and do my reporting that there suddenly seemed to be Jews everywhere. Two of Lech Wałęsa's top advisors, for example, in Poland were Jewish. The Prime Minister of Romania after communism collapsed was the grandson of a rabbi. Within a few months after the Berlin Wall falling, on one street in East Berlin, 3 Jewish organizations had been set up. Of course, they were all feuding with each other, which I think is always a sign of healthy Jewish life. They even set up rival kosher cafes. And even more astonishingly, when I went back to Budapest, someone took me to a Jewish nursery school that had just opened. And it was a very bright and lively scene. There were lots of kids running around, sitting in little chairs, learning about the holidays. But I noticed as the teachers began to speak, behind the children were their parents, sitting in larger chairs with notebooks and pencils out taking notes, because they had never been told by their parents about being Jewish, and now they were going to school with their children to learn about what had been hidden from them.
You just touched on another part of for me, when I got this book, was my own discovery of what I didn't know, and that was that when the war ended, there was a kind of blank space for me as an American. Almost my entire knowledge and experience with Jews in post-Holocaust life were Jews who had come to this country or who had gone to Israel. And the whole idea of what was it like, what must it have been like to stay after the war was over?
Right, I think we tend to forget that while Hitler killed 6 million Jews, more than 700,000 Jews survived in Eastern Europe, separate from the Soviet Union after World War II. Most of those Jews left soon after. They went to Israel or to Great Britain or to the United States. But about 175 or 200,000 Jews either chose to stay or were unable to leave right after World War II. And they were the ones who returned to their villages, returned to their cities to try to see what kind of life they could try to rebuild.
I've asked you to read a passage from your book that deals specifically with what that was like, to try to come back home and what the reception was like.
This is about a small town in Poland called Żelechów, which is a key part of one of the family stories I tell in here about actually a Catholic family that had lived in this town, but also about the Jews who had lived in this town as well. And this is right after World War II. 3 million of Poland's 3.5 million Jews were killed by the Nazis in death camps, built on Polish soil, often near Polish villages, and with Poles looking on. As the Russians liberated the country, the few Jews who had survived began to return to their villages and towns. Most were alone, and their first impulse was to go home to see what remained. Nothing remained. Immediate family and distant relatives were gone, all dead. Every remnant of hundreds of years of Jewish life was obliterated. The Nazis had leveled synagogues, destroyed Jewish schools, ripped up tombstones from Jewish graves. Many Poles looked askance at the returning Jews, as if they were unexpected and unwelcome ghosts. Still alive, their neighbors asked, didn't the Nazis kill you? The Nazis had given Jewish homes, shops, possessions to Poles as they cleared out the Jews from city after city, village after village. Now Poles and the returning Jews fought over houses and stores, over furniture, heirloom, china, even portraits of Jewish ancestors hanging on the walls. We Jews of Poland have never been coddled by our neighbors, and we knew they did not love us, a Jewish woman said at the time, but never until the years of horror after World War II did we realize how deep is their hatred. By 1947, in the small town of Żelechów, which had once been 70% Jewish, there were no signs that Jews had ever lived there. The cemetery became overgrown. The Jewish temple that had once dominated the center of town had been destroyed. While they occupied the town, the Nazis had turned a school for rabbis into the headquarters for the SS. The pathway leading to the front door was paved with gravestones ransacked from the Jewish cemetery. The Nazis left, the gravestones stayed. The building became a village office. The gravestones lay mute, weathering beneath the heat of the summer sun, the weight of the winter snow, and the shuffling shoes of Poles going about their daily lives.
How did you choose the people you decided to talk about in this book, the 5 families?
Well, once it became clear that there were these Jewish communities that had survived, I wanted to know how they had managed it, what their stories had been, but also as I began to see more and more signs of Jews trying to rebuild these communities, what they thought of the future. So I decided to focus on 5 families, and even though the book is all factual, structured it like a novel.
The structure of the book is wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
It's very extraordinary.
I wanted families that reflected the moral choices that people had to make. Some Jews became communists, some became dissidents, some were just caught up in the maelstrom and tried to make their way as best they could. And some didn't even know that they were Jewish, much like Madeleine Albright's family and similar families. They were families whose parents had been so traumatized by the Holocaust that they never wanted to let their children know about their real background. But I also wanted family stories that reflected some of the tensions within families. I think in this country, the movie that plays in our head perhaps about communism is sort of James Bond, or this notion that there was kind of a good and evil. But in fact, when you got to know some of these families, whether they were communists or dissidents, and got to hear about the arguments people had over the kitchen table, the way they struggled with these issues, I think that really allowed me, and I think allows readers, to get in the shoes of these people and see the very difficult choices
the compromises
that they had to make.
People had to make every day to survive.
Exactly. I mean, it's interesting. In Czechoslovakia, for example, I write about the Whitman family, which, much like Madeleine Albright's family, had actually converted before World War II. They had converted to Protestantism instead of Catholicism. And that didn't matter when Hitler came to power. They were put in concentration camps and labor camps. And after World War II, like many Jews and like many Czechs, they actually returned to Czechoslovakia, believing that there would be this period of democracy and freedom. And when the communists took over, of course, that immediately ended. And Elena Whitman, who was about 24 at the time, who had survived the Nazis, was arrested as a spy for Israel, as a Zionist spy, just because she had been born Jewish. She was put into prison, she was interrogated, her children were taken away from her, and her youngest child was put into an orphanage for 2 years because the communists didn't believe that a Jew could raise a loyal communist. And during these interrogations, the communists would shout at her and other Jews, "What Hitler did not finish, we will complete." Which they almost achieved. Over the next 30 years, they shut down synagogues, they turned rabbis into informers. And in this atmosphere, Elena decided that she would never tell her daughter, who was born after she was released from prison, about their Jewish background.
And in fact, I think it was Elena who told you that for her, life under Stalin, life under communism was worse than during the Holocaust.
Because I think what she believed was that it was the Germans who had brought Nazism to Czechoslovakia. What upset her about communism was that it was the Czechs who were doing it, the people in a way that her parents had converted to become Protestants, to become more part of Czech society. And now the communists, as Czechs, were turning against her. What's remarkable about the Whitman family, I think, is that even despite never talking about being Jewish, Sylvia Whitman, her daughter, by the time she's in her 20s, in the 1980s, actually begins to rediscover her Jewish background. She finds some books in the living room that have Jewish writing in them. She begins to meet other people who also don't celebrate Christmas, who don't have many relatives alive because they were killed during the war. And she actually begins to form study groups in her living room, moving from place to place to talk about what it means to be Jewish. And those, I think, are the seeds of the Jewish revival that's going on today.
Her story also, Sylvia's story, it raises a complexity about this whole matter of compromise. And I mean, it's one of the most sort of frustrating moments in the entire book when this young woman, who partly because she's young and rebellious, embraces the Jewish faith, is a dissident and a rabble-rouser. The lists are published after the fall of communism. Who cooperated, who collaborated, and her name is on the list.
Exactly, and she's accused of being an informer. And I think that one of the reasons I decided to write about the family was that it showed the kind of pressure that people were under and the choices people had to make. And I think that under that kind of pressure, people tried to do the best they could. Some people were heroes. I mean, I write about a rabbi in Hungary who was a very charismatic, a very popular figure, so charismatic that the communists, after the Six-Day War in 1967, stripped him of his job, imprisoned him, basically drove him underground for 25 years. Through all that time, he never lost faith. He taught underground Hebrew classes. He would meet with young people whenever he could. He always tried to stay one step ahead of the secret police.
He's sort of like Natan Sharansky in a way. I mean,
right.
a man of great principle, would not compromise.
Right. And after communism collapses, he is actually elected to the parliament, the first democratically elected rabbi to join the Hungarian parliament. So his courage turns out to be a triumph. But I think many more people were like the Whitmans, like Sylvia, and like many others, who, day by day tried to survive. And I think it's hard for us to imagine what it was like to live under these regimes. But, in East Germany, for example, it turns out that 1/4 of East Germans were informers for the secret police, which means that in every home, in every workplace, there were always informers there. And that was one of the reasons why I think Eastern Europe looked like a cemetery to us, because there were secret police and informers in all the synagogues and so forth. And so the Jews who were trying to keep something alive never went near those institutions, but instead tried to do things secretly.
The timing of this book is really astonishing. You mentioned the story that's been in the papers about Madeleine Albright and discovering her history. And it's one of the great ironies of this chapter, this long chapter in history, is that the further we get from it, the more detail we seem to be able to see.
Right. No, and I think that was striking to me too. I mean, I think we tend to think after the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, well, all this was behind us. But I think also with the Nazi gold story in Switzerland, we're seeing the return of this history. And I think for these countries also, it's a very powerful experience because many of these countries were almost frozen in a nightmare for 45 or 50 years under communism. And suddenly communism is over and they can try to reconnect their history with what happened before World War II. And in addition to the Jewish life that's reviving, I think, across Eastern Europe, you're also seeing a real upsurge in interest among Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, and Germans in Jewish life. In Berlin, for example, klezmer music, the sort of Jewish jazz, has become enormously popular. The old Jewish neighborhood has become a very trendy area with cafes and so forth. In Czechoslovakia, Jews are very involved in kind of an artistic revival. And I think part of that is an effort on the part of the people in these countries to understand what they lost. As I said, when the Jews were exterminated, not only were the synagogues emptied, but culture was destroyed. I mean, when I was in Germany, for example, there was a conference about why doesn't Germany have a sense of humor?
It sounded excruciating.
Right, which droned on for days and ended with one of the conclusions being that so many of the satirists and comedians in Germany before World War II were Jewish. Now that sounds like a trivial thing, but I think it's emblematic of the broader loss that all these countries have felt. And I think the Jews who have remained and their children who are trying to build a life there are trying to reintroduce that Jewish accent into Eastern European life. And I think that many Eastern Europeans are welcoming that and are very intrigued by it.
This is really, at its heart, a book about identity. Not just the identity of the families that you spoke with or Jewish life, but really of these nations as a whole, and really what kind of world we live in and want to live in.
It's interesting. I mean, one of the stories I tell in there in Poland, which the section I was reading talks about this small town, and it's actually a lead-in to discuss the story of a Catholic family in Poland, and a young woman named Barbara.
It's one of the saddest stories in the book.
Barbara had been, I mean, she was raised Catholic, as most Poles were, in fact, Catholic. Her mother roused her to go to church every Sunday, and she took communion. And then, and in many ways, her family benefited from the Holocaust. When I talk about the way houses were given to Poles, when the Jewish ghetto was liquidated in Warsaw in 1943, her family actually moved to a bigger apartment in the old Jewish ghetto, a former Jewish apartment. And even when the communists unleashed these anti-Semitic campaigns that continued in the 50s and 60s, she turned her head and didn't pay much attention. In 1986, her mother died. And she was going through her mother's papers and discovered a scrap of an envelope with some return addresses on it, and one in Australia, one in Sweden. And she wrote to these people and said, I never met you, but I gather you knew my mother, and I just want to let you know that she's passed away. And on New Year's Day 1987, the phone rang in her little apartment in Warsaw, and it was a woman from Sweden calling. And the woman said, thank you for your note. I did know your mother. I was sorry to hear that she died. And there was this long pause, and she said, I have to tell you, your mother's not your mother, your name isn't Ascendrich, it's Zeidler, and you're not Catholic, you're Jewish. It turned out she had actually been given up by her Jewish parents in 1943 to this Catholic woman, along with a little bag of gold and a pocket watch. And this Catholic woman had saved her life, had adopted her, treated her as her own daughter, and had never told her the truth because there was still so much anti-Semitism after the war and under the communists. She'd always meant to tell her daughter the truth, to tell Barbara the truth, but she died of a stroke. And on her deathbed, had kept on saying, there's just one thing, but had never been able to tell the whole story. So at a time when Poland is throwing off communism, she had to go in search of her real identity. And what was so painful for her, I think, is that while she was very excited about it, her husband was not.
His family was not.
She went back to this small village, and people in the village at first were kind of very excited, but the more she pursued it, they turned very cool towards her. Several of her husband's relatives said, you know, forget those Jews, you're Catholic, don't worry about that. And it's caused her real pain. It's also brought her, I think, a measure of closure in that she has joined the Jewish community, she goes to synagogue. But it hasn't been an easy road for her. And I think all these questions of identity on every side of the question just become very difficult. And I think especially in Europe, I mean, in America, I think we forget, you know, being Jewish is something that's accepted, and it has, you know, and Jews have done very well here. I found the young Jews that I met in Eastern Europe were fascinated by me because the notion that you could be Jewish and a reporter for a major newspaper, or be Jewish and a business person, or be Jewish and be a violinist, was very strange to them, because for them, being Jewish was the single most important thing. It was on their passport. It meant they could be dismissed from their jobs.
Still
it meant
define
their parents
their
had been
lives.
arrested. Exactly. And they really now are striving for a kind of normalcy that we take for granted.
And it's a matter of who defines what does it mean to be Jewish. And that again is one of the central questions of this book, because for One family, it was a religious identity. For another, it was a cultural identity, intellectual life. Another, it was an ethnic identity.
And other Jews became communists. I mean, it's one of the great untold stories, I think, about this period, is that many Jews joined the Communist Party out of idealism, but after World War II discovered that being Jewish does not inoculate you from opportunism or ambition. And the family I write about in East Germany, the Gysi family, is an extraordinary family where Klaus Gysi rose to become one of the most prominent politicians in East Germany, a very powerful man. He was Minister of Culture. He banned Beatles records in the 1960s. He was Minister of Religious Affairs.
Although his son got to
his
have
son listened
Beatles
to them,
records.
exactly. His mother had joined the Communist Party and enrolled her son Klaus when he was only 16 years old. What was interesting, I think, about these Jewish communists is that they didn't consider their Jewish background important. And Klaus's son, Gregor, who grew up in East Germany and was a communist, always knew he was Jewish but didn't think much of it until 2 weeks after the Berlin Wall fell. When Gregor Gysi at that point had eclipsed his father, he had actually been elected as head of the Communist Party. Even though he was a communist, he had been critical of the regime and had spoken out.
There's a moment in the book where these two men are standing really in the same place, but it really signifies the changing of the guard and the passing of the torch in the family.
I mean, they had quarreled all the time, as fathers and sons often do. And at one point, right after the Berlin Wall fell, Gregor Gysi stood up at this campaign rally to give a speech, and people started shouting, "Jews out, Jews out." And Gregor was stunned and turned to someone on the platform and said, "I can understand if they could criticize me by saying communists out or socialists out, but how can they criticize me for something I can't help?" Nevertheless, he persevered and actually is now one of the most powerful politicians in Germany, certainly the most powerful left-wing politician. And he and his father, after he sort of led his party to a key victory, they met and they talked. And his father was really unusually emotional. And he said to his son, "You know, you've given my life new meaning." And I think what that represented was that for so many Jews who had joined the Communist Party out of a kind of idealism and belief that things would turn out well for them, felt so betrayed by what the communists did. And I think the notion that you could have someone who in 1990s Germany could reemerge as a leading political force, as both a Jew and as a communist, in a family that had been communist for 3 generations, I think brought father and son closer together. But I think it was also very important for Germany because once again you have someone who is a leading figure who is Jewish. And I think that many Germans are very fascinated by that and intrigued by it. There were tremendous outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Germany after the wall fell, but at the same time there's this fascination with Jews. And I think that that's kind of a paradox that's likely to continue for a while.
Was that a kind of, when you talk about what happened after the wall fell, in the book, it seems like it was almost a kind of spasm. It happened very quickly. It was very unpleasant and violent, and then it stopped.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. I mean, the first 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell, when I was living in Berlin, there were more than 2,000 right-wing attacks in Germany. Synagogues were desecrated, cemeteries were vandalized, but also Turkish homes were firebombed.
It was foreigners.
Gypsies, anyone who was foreign. More than 20 people were killed during that time in these right-wing attacks. And many of the families I write about actually thought of leaving Eastern Europe at that time, having survived the Holocaust, having survived the communists, at this point in the 1990s, thought of leaving. But they decided to stay, and I think spasm is precisely the right word, because what happened, unlike as in the 1930s, what happened this time was that I think the political leaders of these countries, the elites, and a lot of educated people realized that if Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Germany wanted to become part of the West, wanted to become part of NATO, wanted to sort of share in the democracy and freedom they were being given, this was unacceptable. And so you had people like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia and even Lech Wałęsa in Poland speaking out against anti-Semitism, going to Israel, trying to come to terms both with their role in the Holocaust, but also what was going on in these countries now. And a reason I'm optimistic, I think, is that I think the young people in these countries, Jewish or not, very much want to become part of the West and really admire America and having lived through communism want democracy and freedom. And I think as in America, as there is more prosperity and education, there can also be a climate of tolerance.
There's
you
no
always have to
going
be
back.
Right. Well, you always have to be careful in Europe, obviously, and in Germany and in all these countries, to be especially careful of that. But I do think that things are different now. And my hope is that they can develop a society that has the kind of tolerance and understanding that we've been struggling towards in this country for a long time. And I think that if they can continue to prosper and grow democratically, that the Jewish life and the other different facets of these countries can also grow with them.
One sort of lingering cautionary feeling, though, from this book. I mean, you describe the difference between Hitler and Stalin, both very destructive men, but Hitler obsessed, completely obsessed with the extermination of Jewish people, to the point where he was going to create a museum of the extinct race to display the artifact. Stalin, much craftier, anti-Semitic, but yet more clever about the way he went about things. Yet both came to power, both individual people, one person really, holding such enormous power.
No, and I think it's the reason why Jews are always very nervous. There's a German phrase, in fact, that the German Jews often use, which is that we're sitting on packed suitcases. In other words, always ready to flee if something happens. And I think there will always be that kind of wariness. But as I say, I think that history has taught many of these Jews the danger signs and what to look out for. And I think what's happening now, in a way, is proof that Hitler did not win and that Stalin did not win. That Museum of an Extinct Race you mentioned was actually supposed to be set up in 4 synagogues in Prague, where all these Torahs and candelabras were supposed to be displayed. And when the communists took over, they kept them as museums. And Sylvia Whitman, who's had discovered her Judaism late in life, just last year called the Prague authorities and said, there are enough Jews here now who have come out of the closet that we need a place to worship for the Jewish New Year, for the high holidays. And so on the day before the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, she went with her little band of young Jews carrying mops and pails and brooms and chairs to one of these museums. They went in, they pushed all the display cases against the wall, they mopped down the floors, they chased the mice back into their mouse holes, they set up the chairs, and this one-time Museum of an Extinct Race was turned back into a synagogue again. And I think that's the kind of thing that's happening, and that really proves that the victory in the end belongs to these younger Jews, not to Hitler.
And life goes on.
Exactly.
Jonathan Kaufman, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Upon Reflection. It's a wonderful book. I hope everyone reads it. A Hole in the Heart of the World. Thank you again.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.